Her billionaire fiancé cornered her in their penthouse and said, "Let my ex move in, or I'll cancel the wedding." She didn't scream, she smiled, and said yes. But he never expected what she'd do next. Because the moment she agreed, his entire plan began to collapse. And by the time he learned the truth about who she really was, it was already too late. Welcome back, my beautiful family, to Mr. Crown Stories. If no one has told you today, let me say it now, you are enough. You are worthy. You are the light that refuses to dim. I create these stories for hearts like yours, bruised but unbroken, searching for dawn after the darkest night. If this story speaks to you, please subscribe, leave a comment saying I am here, and tell me where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I'll return with another story, and you won't want to miss it. Every word is written for you, the one who faced betrayal and still chose to stand. May hope find your heart, may your burdens lighten, and may your spirit shine brighter with each new day. Let's walk this journey together, hand in hand, heart to heart. Now, let us begin. The champagne had been poured into crystal flutes that caught the sunset like liquid gold. The flowers, white peonies and blush roses, had been arranged with a kind of precision that only unlimited money could buy. The guests had flown in from 3 continents to witness what Manhattan society was calling the romance of the decade. Rebecca Cole stood at the center of the Ritter Global Penthouse Ballroom wearing a champagne satin engagement dress that hugged her like a second skin, surrounded by 300 people who had come to celebrate her fairy tale ending. The string quartet played Pachelbel's Canon softly in the background, each note floating through air perfumed with imported French roses. Her best friend Noelle was dabbing happy tears in the corner, clutching her champagne like a lifeline. John Ritter's parents were beaming with the satisfaction of parents who believed their billionaire son had finally chosen well. Everything was absolutely, breathtakingly perfect. Until the moment it wasn't. John stood up with his champagne glass raised, and Rebecca thought he was about to make one of those beautiful toasts he was famous for, the kind that made investors write checks and reporters write love letters to his public image. Instead, he cleared his throat with a kind of authority that made 300 people fall instantly, unervingly silent, and said words that would split her world down the middle. "I need everyone here to understand something important." His voice carried across the marble floors with absolute confidence. "Tasha Vale will always be part of my life. We built something together that I can't simply erase. She's moving into the penthouse with us after the wedding." He turned to look directly at Rebecca, his blue eyes cold despite his warm smile. "Rebecca, Tasha is moving in with us. If you can't accept that, I'll cancel the wedding. Right now. Tonight." The silence that followed was the kind that pressed against your chest and made breathing feel like work. Rebecca felt 300 pairs of eyes swing toward her like searchlights, waiting no hungry, for the spectacle they'd come to witness. They wanted tears streaming down her beautiful face, mascara running in black rivers. They wanted her to scream, to throw her 5-carat engagement ring at his head with perfect dramatic flair, to collapse into the arms of someone who would carry her out while she sobbed. She could hear Noelle's sharp intake of breath from across the room, could practically feel her friend calculating the fastest route to reach her, ready to destroy John Ritter where he stood. She could see John's mother's hand fly to her mouth in absolute horror, genuine shock registering across a face that had perfected the art of polite indifference. Behind John, Tasha Vale stood like a sculpture carved from ice and ambition, elegant in white silk, her expression hovering somewhere between pity and triumph. But something happened in that moment that surprised even Rebecca herself. A strange crystalline calm washed over her, the kind that comes when you realize the worst thing has already happened and you're still standing upright, still breathing, still fundamentally intact. She looked at John, really looked at him for perhaps the first time in their 18-month relationship, and saw him with absolute devastating clarity. He wasn't trying to hurt her. That would have been easier to understand, easier to forgive. He genuinely believed he was being honest, evolved, modern. He thought this was a negotiation, not an execution. He thought she would cry, accept, and shrink herself to fit into whatever twisted arrangement he designed. Rebecca reached up slowly and fastened the delicate gold necklace around her throat, the one her mother had given her that morning with tears in her eyes. She lifted her chin, and the smile that crossed her face was so serene, so genuinely peaceful, that it unsettled everyone in the room more than any scream ever could. Okay. Just one word. Soft as silk. Nuclear as fallout. She set down her champagne glass, the gentle clink sounding like a judge's gavel in the silent room. Thank you all for coming to what has been a truly enlightening evening. Then she walked. Not ran. Not stumbled. Not fled. She walked, spine straight, head high, each step of her champagne heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that sounded like a victory march, like a drumbeat announcing the arrival of someone who'd just been set free. She walked past John's mother, who reached for her arm with desperate apologies already forming on her lips. She walked past Noelle, whose face was a mixture of pride and rage and absolute shock. She walked past the guests who parted like water, their expensive perfumes and colognes creating a gauntlet of wealth she no longer needed. And she walked straight through those towering double doors into the cool Manhattan night without looking back even once. Noelle caught up with her in the underground parking garage, still clutching both their purses and Rebecca's phone, her heels echoing like gunshots in the concrete space. Rebecca. Wait. Oh my God, wait. Rebecca turned, and Noelle expected to see her best friend finally break apart, to see the facade crack and the tears come flooding through. Instead, Rebecca's face was eerily peaceful in the harsh fluorescent lighting, almost luminous with a calm that seemed otherworldly. Did you hear what he said up there? Noelle's voice cracked with fury. Everyone heard what he said. Rebecca, I'm going to go back up there and push him off his own damn balcony. I'm going to destroy him with my bare hands. I'm going to. No. The word came out quiet, but carried a weight Noelle had never heard in her friend's voice before. It was steel wrapped in velvet, power contained in stillness. He just did me the biggest favor of my life, Noelle. He showed me exactly who he is before I signed away my name, my freedom, and my future. Before I became Mrs. John Ritter and forgot I was ever Rebecca Cole. They drove to Rebecca's apartment in Noelle's Mercedes, and for the first 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. The city lights blurred past the windows like tears Rebecca refused to cry, the Manhattan skyline glittering with all the beautiful indifference it was famous for. Finally, Noelle broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. You're scaring me. You should be crying. You should be angry. You should be something other than this supernatural calm. This isn't normal, Beck. Rebecca turned from the window, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quality Noelle had never heard before. Something awakened, something powerful, something that had been sleeping far too long. I am something, Noelle. I'm awake. For the first time in 18 months, I'm completely, brutally, beautifully awake. When they reached Rebecca's luxury apartment in Tribeca, the one she'd insisted on keeping despite John's repeated suggestions that she move into his penthouse early, Rebecca kicked off her heels and sank onto the cream leather sofa. The engagement dress that had cost her 3 months of her architecture firm's profits suddenly felt like a costume designed for someone else's life, someone smaller, someone who had agreed to disappear. Noelle hovered nearby, vibrating with helpless energy. Okay, what do you need? Ice cream? Wine? A baseball bat so we can go back and smash the windows of his Bentley? Because I'm absolutely ready to commit felony property damage right now. Just say the word. Rebecca laughed, and the sound was strange in the quiet apartment, not bitter, not broken, just surprised by itself. Do you remember that lawyer who kept calling me? The one from Sterling and Associates. Noelle frowned, confusion displacing her rage for a moment. The one about your father? The father who abandoned you and your mom before you were even born? What about him? He died 3 months ago. The lawyer said something about an estate. I've been ignoring the calls because I was so consumed with wedding planning, and I figured it was probably just some old watch or maybe a small insurance policy meant to ease a guilty conscience. Rebecca pulled out her phone and stared at the list of missed calls. There were 23 of them spanning 3 months, each one more urgent than the last. Are you seriously thinking about estate lawyers right now? Noelle's voice pitched higher with disbelief. Rebecca, you just had your engagement destroyed in front of 300 people by a man who decided his ex-girlfriend was more important than you. This can wait until. Call it shock or call it clarity, but right now I need something, anything, To focus on that isn't John Ritter's face and the sound of Tasha Vale's heels clicking behind him. Rebecca dialed before she could second-guess herself. It rang 4 times before a man answered, his voice professional but warm, like expensive bourbon. Sterling and Associates. Richard Sterling speaking. This is Rebecca Cole. I apologize for not returning your calls. I understand you've been trying to reach me about my father. There was a pause. Then the man's voice changed entirely, taking on an urgency that made Rebecca sit up straighter. Miss Cole. Yes. I've been trying to reach you for quite some time with increasing concern. Are you available to meet tonight? I know it's late, nearly midnight, but this matter is exceptionally urgent, and I've been given specific instructions to handle this with absolute priority the moment you responded. Rebecca looked at Noel, who was making increasingly frantic hand gestures that ranged from "Are you insane?" to "Have you lost your entire mind?" Tonight? It's almost midnight. Can't this wait until... Miss Cole, your father's instructions were very specific. He wanted you to know immediately. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Immediately. I can be at your location within the hour if you're willing to meet. I promise you, this cannot wait. Something in his voice made Rebecca's pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something she couldn't name yet. Something that felt like the universe shifting beneath her feet. All right. I'll text you my address. They waited in tense silence, both still in their party clothes. Rebecca couldn't bring herself to take off the engagement dress yet. It felt like admitting something she wasn't quite ready to name, like acknowledging that the life she'd imagined for the past 18 months had just evaporated like champagne left too long in the glass. Noelle paced the apartment like a caged lioness. This is insane. You know that, right? Some random lawyer calls you at midnight on the worst night of your life, and you just invite him to your apartment? What if he's a serial killer? What if? The knock came exactly 1 hour later, so precise it could have been timed with an atomic clock. Richard Sterling was a distinguished man in his early 60s with silver hair, kind eyes behind expensive glasses, and a presence that radiated both competence and compassion. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly rent and wore a suit that suggested he'd interrupted something important to be here. He looked at Rebecca with something that might have been sympathy, might have been respect, might have been both. Miss Cole. Thank you for seeing me at this unusual hour. Please come in. This is my best friend, Noel Carter. He nodded politely at Noel, then moved to the sofa with the careful precision of someone who carried important things. When he opened his briefcase, Rebecca caught a glimpse of thick folders, official-looking documents with gold seals, and what looked like photographs. First, he began, his voice gentle, let me express my condolences for your loss. Your father was an extraordinary man. Complicated, certainly, but extraordinary nonetheless. I barely knew him, Rebecca said honestly, the words tasting strange in her mouth. He left before I was born. There was no relationship. No phone calls. No birthday cards. Nothing. Just a name on a birth certificate and a lifetime of questions my mother refused to answer. I'm aware of the circumstances, Richard said carefully. Your father was aware of them too. He carried profound regret about the choices he made. He wanted to reach out, wanted to explain, but felt too much time had passed. Felt he'd forfeited the right to your time, your attention, your forgiveness. He pulled out a thick folder, the kind that held the weight of something life-altering. However, Miss Cole, that doesn't change what he wanted for you. What he spent the last 20 years of his life building specifically for you. I don't understand, Rebecca whispered, something in her chest beginning to crack open, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Richard Sterling met her eyes directly. Miss Cole, your father, Marcus Cole, was the founder and CEO of Cole Innovations, one of the largest sustainable luxury housing development corporations in North America. When he died 3 months ago, he left explicit instructions in his will. He paused, and Rebecca felt the world tilt on its axis. You are the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. Which means, as of his death, you now own 51% controlling interest in Cole Innovations, multiple patents for sustainable smart home technology that are currently valued in the hundreds of millions, real estate holdings across 4 countries, investment portfolios, and liquid assets. Noelle made a sound like a strangled cat. The estate, independently valued by 3 separate firms, is worth approximately $1.3 billion. He said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, as if he just told her the weather forecast. You now own all of it, Miss Cole. As of tonight, you are a billionaire. The words hung in the air like smoke signals from another dimension. Rebecca heard them, but they didn't compute. They were sounds without meaning, numbers too large to have any relationship with reality. She felt like she was watching this scene happen to someone else, like she'd stepped outside her own body and was observing from a great distance. Noelle made another choking sound, then slowly, almost cinematically, slid off the couch onto the floor with a thud that shook the coffee table and knocked over an empty champagne flute. I'm sorry, Rebecca said slowly, her voice coming from very far away. Can you repeat that number? $1.3 billion, Richard repeated, pulling out document after document, spreading them across her coffee table like tarot cards revealing an impossible future. Your father was one of the wealthiest men in the country. He was intensely private about his fortune, but he built something remarkable. And he left all of it to you. Noelle was still on the floor, staring at the ceiling and making breathing sounds that suggested she was either hyperventilating or having an out-of-body experience. Rebecca looked down at the papers Richard was arranging with careful precision. Deeds to properties in Manhattan, Dubai, London, and Singapore. Bank statements with balances that had so many zeros they stopped looking like real numbers. Patent documents for technology she didn't understand. Stock certificates. Investment portfolios. A photograph of a building in Midtown with Cole Innovations emblazoned across the top in letters that could be seen from space. I don't understand, Rebecca whispered, her hands beginning to tremble. Why me? He left us. He never called, never wrote, never. Why would he leave me this? Why would he leave me anything at all? Richard's expression softened in a way that suggested he'd been waiting for this question, had prepared for this exact moment. He was too proud, Miss Cole. Too ashamed of abandoning you and your mother. He felt he'd forfeited the right to your life. But he never stopped watching you from afar. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a worn leather journal, its edges soft with age and handling, its pages thick with the weight of years of words. He kept these. He wrote about you constantly. About your high school graduation, your acceptance to Columbia, your master's degree in architecture, the launch of your firm, your first major contract. He followed every achievement, every milestone, every success. He knew about your engagement. Richard opened the journal, and Rebecca saw her father's handwriting, strong, decisive, running across pages and pages of entries. Rebecca graduated summa cum laude today. I watched from the back row. She looked so much like her mother. So brilliant. So strong. I wanted to go to her, to tell her I'm sorry, but I have no right. I gave up that right 27 years ago. Another entry, dated 2 years earlier. She started her own firm today. Cole Architecture and Design. She kept my name. After everything, she kept my name. I don't deserve that grace. And another, dated just 4 months ago. She's engaged to John Ritter. I've had my team investigate him. Something doesn't feel right. I pray I'm wrong. I pray he's worthy of her. But I'm putting contingencies in place. If anything happens, if he hurts her, if she needs a way out, I'm making sure she'll never need anyone ever again. Rebecca's hand shook as she touched the pages, her father's words blurring as tears finally, began to fall. He knew, she whispered. He knew about John. He suspected, Richard corrected gently. He was preparing to protect you even after his death. And Miss Cole, there's something else you need to know. He pulled out another document, this one with the Ritter Global logo emblazoned across the top. For the past 2 years, Ritter Global has been trying to acquire your father's patents. They've made multiple offers, each one more aggressive than the last. Your father refused every single one. He didn't trust John Ritter with his life's work. And now? Richard looked at her with something that might have been pride. Now those patents belong to you. Which means John Ritter has been courting you, possibly from the very beginning, with a secondary agenda. His company desperately needs those patents to remain competitive in the sustainable housing market. Without them, Ritter Global falls behind every major competitor. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Rebecca thought about John's sudden interest in her firm. His enthusiasm about combining their professional worlds. His repeated suggestions that she should meet his corporate team. His insistence on a quick engagement, a spring wedding. It had never been just about love. It had never been only about her. "Miss Cole," Richard said quietly, "you just walked away from a man who was trying to use you. And by midnight, you became powerful enough that you'll never be used by anyone again." Rebecca sat frozen on her cream leather sofa, surrounded by documents that redefined her entire existence. The engagement dress that had felt like a costume an hour ago now felt like a relic from another lifetime, from a version of herself who had been willing to shrink, to accommodate, to disappear into someone else's shadow. She looked down at the journal again, her father's handwriting swimming before her eyes. If she ever needs to walk away from anything or anyone, I want her to have the power to do it without fear, without consequence, without ever having to compromise herself for security. The entry was dated just 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks before his death. As if he'd known. As if he'd been preparing this exact moment. "How long did he follow me?" Rebecca's voice came out barely above a whisper. How long was he watching? Richard Sterling's expression carried the weight of years of secrets finally being released. "Your entire life, Miss Cole. From the moment you were born, he had people ensuring you were safe, tracking your milestones, documenting your achievements. Not invasively, he never interfered, never approached you. He simply watched over you from afar, like a guardian angel who felt he'd lost the right to be acknowledged." Noelle finally pulled herself off the floor, still looking like she'd been hit by a truck made of pure disbelief. Wait. Wait. Her voice climbed an octave with each word. "You're telling me that Rebecca, my Rebecca, who splits grocery bills down to the penny and has been saving for 2 years to expand her firm, is now a billionaire? With a B. Like 9 zeros. Technically, it's closer to 10 zeros, Richard corrected gently. After liquidating certain assets and accounting for current market valuations of the patents." Noelle sat down hard on the coffee table, her hand pressed against her chest like she was physically holding her heart inside her body. "I need you to say that number again. Slowly. Because I think I'm having a stroke." $1.3 billion, Richard repeated, and this time he allowed himself a small smile. Plus or minus 50 million depending on stock fluctuations. "Oh well, plus or minus 50 million, Noelle said, her voice pitching into hysteria. "That's just pocket change. No big deal. Rebecca, I'm actually having a heart attack. This is what a heart attack feels like." But Rebecca wasn't listening to Noelle's spiral. She was staring at another entry in the journal, this one dated 3 years ago. Rebecca presented her first major commercial project today, the Riverside development. "I sat in the back of the presentation room disguised as a potential investor. She was magnificent. Confident, brilliant, articulate. She inherited my mind for spatial design and her mother's grace under pressure. I wanted to stand up and tell everyone in that room, that's my daughter. But I have no right to that pride. I forfeited it 27 years ago." A sob caught in Rebecca's throat. All those years she'd wondered if he ever thought about her, if he ever regretted leaving, if he ever cared whether she existed. And he'd been there. In the back row. Watching. Caring. Documenting every moment of a life he felt too ashamed to enter. "There are 43 journals," Richard said quietly, watching her reaction. "One for each year since you were born. He wrote in them almost daily. He wanted you to have them all. To understand that even though he wasn't present, you were never, not for a single day, unloved." Rebecca's hands trembled as she closed the journal, her tears falling onto the worn leather cover. Why didn't he just call me? Send a letter? Knock on my door? Why did he have to die before I could know him? Shame is a powerful prison, Miss Cole. Your father built an empire, revolutionized sustainable housing, changed the landscape of urban development, but he never forgave himself for leaving your mother. For leaving you. He felt he'd committed the one sin that couldn't be undone. He was wrong, of course. But by the time he realized it, he'd convinced himself too much time had passed. Richard pulled out another document, this one crisp and official. But he could ensure that you'd never be trapped the way he trapped himself. Never be powerless. Never have to stay in a situation or relationship because you lacked resources or options. He slid the document across the coffee table toward her. It was thick, bound in navy leather, with gold lettering that read, Last Will and Testament of Marcus Anthony Cole. I need you to sign here, acknowledging receipt of the inheritance. And here, confirming your identity as the beneficiary. And here, accepting the terms of the trust, though there are virtually no restrictions. He wanted you to have complete freedom to do whatever you choose with the empire he built. Rebecca stared at the pages, at the signature lines waiting for her name, the name she'd shared with a father she never knew, a name she'd kept despite her mother's suggestion to change it, despite the questions, despite everything. Rebecca and Cole. She picked up the heavy fountain pen Richard offered, its weight substantial in her hand, and signed. Each signature felt like a door opening, like a new version of herself stepping forward. When she finished, Richard carefully gathered the documents and placed them back in his briefcase. There's one more thing you should know, Miss Cole. He pulled out a final folder, this one marked with the Ritter Global logo. Your father's company, your company now, holds patents that Ritter Global has been trying to acquire for nearly 3 years. Patents for sustainable smart home technology that would revolutionize their entire housing division. They've made 6 separate acquisition offers, each one more aggressive than the last. Your father refused all of them. Rebecca's mind began connecting dots with horrifying clarity. When did they make the first offer? Richard consulted the document. 2 years and 3 months ago. 2 years and 3 months ago. Exactly 1 month before John Ritter had walked into her architecture firm's gallery showing, charming and attentive, claiming he'd seen her work featured in Architectural Digest and wanted to commission a project. The timeline aligned with surgical precision. He knew, Rebecca whispered. John knew who my father was. He knew about the patents. That's why he... I can't speak to Mr. Ritter's motivations, Richard said carefully. But I can tell you that he absolutely knew Marcus Cole was your father. That information isn't difficult to obtain for someone with his resources. And I can tell you that 6 weeks ago, Ritter Global's board of directors gave John an ultimatum: acquire Cole Innovations patents within 6 months, or face a vote of no confidence. 6 weeks ago. The same time John had suddenly accelerated their wedding timeline. The same time he'd suggested they consolidate their lives faster. The same time Tasha Vale had conveniently returned from her 2 years abroad. Rebecca felt something cold and sharp solidify in her chest. Not heartbreak, but clarity. Absolute, crystalline clarity. Everything was strategic, she said, and her voice didn't shake. The relationship. The engagement. The rushed wedding. Even tonight, making that scene, forcing me to walk away, he probably assumed I'd come crawling back, desperate and compliant. Noelle, who had been silent through this revelation, finally spoke, her voice deadly calm. I'm going to kill him. Rebecca, I'm actually, legitimately going to commit murder. They'll understand. The jury will understand. Any reasonable person would understand. Richard Sterling allowed himself a slight smile. I would advise against homicide, Miss Carter. However, I would recommend that Miss Cole consider the significant leverage she now holds. He looked at Rebecca directly, and in his eyes she saw something that might have been respect, might have been admiration. Miss Cole, you're not just wealthy. You now control technology that determines whether Ritter Global remains competitive in the sustainable housing market. You hold patents they desperately need. You have voting power over contracts they're pursuing. And your net worth. He paused, letting the words settle like snow. Your net worth exceeds the Ritter family's personal fortune by approximately $400 million. You don't just outrank John Ritter. You outrank his entire family. His company is worth more, yes, but personally? You are wealthier, more powerful, and infinitely more protected than you were 3 hours ago. The room fell silent except for the sound of Manhattan traffic 30 floors below, a distant reminder that the world was still spinning, still moving, utterly unaware that Rebecca Cole's entire existence had just shifted on its axis. Rebecca looked down at her hands, the same hands that had fastened a gold necklace with perfect calm 3 hours ago. The same hands that had held a champagne glass and walked away from a man who'd tried to cage her. The same hands that had just signed documents making her one of the wealthiest women in the country. She looked up at Richard Sterling, and when she spoke, her voice carried a strength she'd never heard in herself before. What happens now? The question hung in the air, simple, profound, enormous with possibility. Richard Sterling closed his briefcase with a soft click that sounded like a starting gun. Now, Miss Cole. His smile was genuine, warm, and carried just a hint of satisfaction. Now you decide who you want to become. And the beautiful thing is, for the first time in your life, you have the resources to become absolutely anything you choose. He stood, straightening his suit jacket. I'll have my team contact you tomorrow to begin the transition process. You'll need to tour the corporate headquarters, meet with the executive board, review the company's current projects and contracts. You'll need legal counsel, financial advisors, a personal security team, all of which your father already arranged. Everything is ready. We've simply been waiting for you. At the door, he paused and turned back. Your father's office has been preserved exactly as he left it. No one has entered it since his death. He left you a letter there, something he wanted you to read in private, when you were ready. There's no rush. But when you're prepared, it's waiting. After Richard left, the apartment felt impossibly quiet. Rebecca and Noelle sat in silence for a long moment, surrounded by the scattered evidence of a life that had completely transformed in the space of 3 hours. Finally, Noelle spoke, her voice small and wondering. Beck, you walked away from John Ritter tonight with nothing but your dignity. And the universe said, hold my champagne. Rebecca laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine and free. I need to take off this dress, she said, standing. This engagement dress. I need to take it off and burn it. Or, Noelle suggested, standing beside her, you could frame it. With a little plaque that says, the last time Rebecca Cole ever made herself small. Rebecca looked at her best friend, and for the first time since walking out of that penthouse, she felt something other than calm or clarity or rage. She felt power. Not the borrowed power of being someone's fiancé or someone's potential acquisition. Her own power. Inherited, yes, but earned through 27 years of wondering, surviving, building, and refusing to break even when breaking would have been easier. What happens now? She repeated, this time to herself. And somewhere in the city, John Ritter was probably sleeping peacefully, having no idea that the woman he'd just discarded had become, in the span of one midnight conversation, powerful enough to destroy everything he'd spent his life building. Rebecca stood outside the glass tower at 485 Madison Avenue, staring up at the letters that spelled out her legacy in gleaming chrome, Cole Innovations. She'd walked past this building 100 times in the past 2 years, never knowing that the company revolutionizing sustainable urban housing belonged to the father she'd never met. Never knowing that someday she would own it. The morning sun reflected off the building's surface like liquid gold, and for a moment, Rebecca felt like she was standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying and absolutely inevitable. You ready for this? Noelle asked beside her, looking uncharacteristically nervous in a sharp blazer she'd borrowed from Rebecca's closet. Because I'm not ready for this. I'm having sympathy anxiety for you. I don't think anyone's ever ready to walk into a billion-dollar company they inherited from a father they never knew, Rebecca said quietly. Then she straightened her spine, adjusted the cream Armani suit she'd chosen with deliberate care, and stepped through the revolving doors. The lobby was a cathedral of glass and steel, 3 stories high with living walls of vertical gardens and water features that created a sound like distant rain. Employees moved through the space with purpose, most of them young, diverse, energetic, the kind of people who believed they were building the future. A woman in her 50s approached immediately, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob, her expression warm but professional. "Miss Cole. We've been expecting you." She extended her hand. "I'm Catherine Wells, Chief Operating Officer. On behalf of everyone at Cole Innovations, welcome home." Home. The word landed strange and significant. "Thank you," Rebecca managed, shaking her hand. "This is my associate, Noel Carter." "Of course. Please, follow me. The executive team is waiting." As they walked through the lobby, Rebecca felt eyes turning toward her, curious, appraising, respectful. Somewhere in this building, people knew. Word had spread overnight through whatever mysterious channels corporate gossip traveled. Marcus Cole's daughter. The heir. The new majority owner. Catherine led them to a private elevator that required a keycard. As they ascended, she spoke with practiced ease. "Your father was an extraordinary leader, Miss Cole. Demanding, certainly. Exacting in his standards. But fair. He built this company on the principle that sustainable luxury shouldn't be exclusive, that everyone deserves to live in spaces that are both beautiful and responsible." "I read about his work," Rebecca said. "The affordable housing initiatives in Detroit. The storm-resistant developments in New Orleans. The solar-integrated communities in Phoenix. All projects he hoped you might continue," Catherine said, and something in her tone suggested she'd known Marcus Cole well. "He spoke about you often in the last few years. Always with pride. Always with regret." The elevator opened directly into the executive floor, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, conference rooms with glass walls, and offices that suggested power without ostentation. 8 people stood waiting in the main conference room, all of them rising as Rebecca entered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine announced, "Rebecca Cole, majority shareholder and new board chair of Cole Innovations." For a moment, Rebecca felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure. These were people who'd built careers, who'd bet their futures on her father's vision. And now they were looking at her, a woman they'd never met, wondering if she would protect what they'd created or destroy it through ignorance. Then a man in his 40s stepped forward, his smile genuine. "Miss Cole, I'm David Chun, Chief Technology Officer. Your father and I worked together for 15 years. He talked about this moment constantly, the day you'd walk through these doors. He made us promise we'd give you time to learn, space to lead, and honest counsel when you asked for it." Something in Rebecca's chest loosened slightly. "Thank you. I'm going to need all 3. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions, presentations, and information. She learned about the company's current projects, 32 developments across North America, joint ventures in Europe and Asia, partnerships with environmental organizations. She learned about the patents her father had developed, revolutionary climate control systems, solar integration technology, water reclamation processes that could transform urban living. And she learned about Ritter Global's persistent, increasingly desperate attempts to acquire those patents. "They've made 7 offers in 3 years, David Chen explained, pulling up a presentation on the conference room screen. Each one more aggressive than the last. The most recent came 6 weeks ago, $2 billion for full patent rights and exclusive licensing agreements." 6 weeks ago. The timeline clicked into place with devastating precision. "Your father refused," Catherine added. "He said the patents weren't for sale at any price. That they represented the future of sustainable housing and shouldn't be controlled by a company that prioritized profit over people." Rebecca stared at the screen, at John Ritter's signature on the most recent offer letter, dated exactly 43 days ago. 3 days before he'd suggested they move up the wedding date. 5 days before he'd taken her to meet his board of directors under the guise of introducing his future wife. 1 week before Tasha Vale had mysteriously returned from Europe. "The patents," Rebecca said slowly, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "How critical are they to Ritter Global's competitive position?" David and Catherine exchanged glances. "Without them," David said carefully, "Ritter Global falls behind every major competitor in the sustainable housing sector. They've built their entire upcoming development strategy around acquiring our technology. Without it, They're looking at a minimum 3-year delay and approximately $1.4 billion in lost projected revenue. They're desperate, Catherine said bluntly. And when companies get desperate, they get creative. Creative. Like encouraging your son to romance the heir. Like staging a rushed engagement. Like creating a scenario where the bride-to-be would be so grateful, so compliant, that she'd sign away anything he asked for. Rebecca's phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it out and saw John's name on the screen. His 5th call since last night. She declined it without hesitation and set the phone face down on the conference table. "Miss Cole," Catherine said gently, "forgive me for being direct, but we're all aware of your personal situation with John Ritter. If you need time to process." "No," Rebecca said, and her voice carried steel. "I need to understand the business. Personal feelings are irrelevant to corporate strategy." Catherine smiled, and it was the smile of a woman recognizing a kindred spirit. "Your father said the exact same thing the day his first marriage ended." The meeting continued with discussions of upcoming projects, financial forecasts, and strategic initiatives. Rebecca absorbed it all, her mind cataloging information with the same precision she used to design architectural spaces. This was just another kind of structure, not walls and windows, but systems and strategies. She was good at structures. By the time they broke for lunch, Rebecca had toured the building, met over 50 employees, and begun understanding the scope of what she'd inherited. This wasn't just wealth. It was responsibility. Legacy. Power that came with the weight of thousands of jobs, millions of dollars, and her father's lifetime of work. In her father's office, now her office, she stood at the window overlooking the city. The space had been preserved exactly as he'd left it. Books on sustainable design lined the shelves. Architectural models of completed projects stood on pedestals. And on the desk, a sealed envelope with her name written in his handwriting. She wasn't ready to open it yet. Noelle appeared in the doorway, holding 2 coffees from the building's cafe. "So," she said, handing Rebecca a cup. "How does it feel to be a corporate titan?" "Terrifying," Rebecca admitted. "And right. Surprisingly right." Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't John, it was a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Miss Cole, this is James Morrison from Ritter Global's executive office." The voice was professional, clipped. "We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the pending acquisition proposal. Mr. Ritter feels it's urgent Mr. Morrison," Rebecca interrupted smoothly, "any business proposal should be directed through Cole Innovation's legal department. I'm sure you have their contact information." "Yes, but given your personal relationship with Mr. Ritter, we thought." "My personal relationship with Mr. Ritter ended last night. Any future interactions will be strictly professional and conducted through appropriate business channels. Good day." She ended the call and found Catherine standing in the doorway, having witnessed the exchange. "There's something else you need to know," Catherine said, her expression grave. "Tasha Vale contacted 3 of our board members this morning, fishing for information about ownership changes, patent status, your involvement with the company." How did she even know? Industry whispers travel fast, especially when they involve a billion-dollar inheritance and the Ritter family. By now, everyone in Manhattan's business community knows Marcus Cole's heir has emerged. They just don't all know yet that you're John Ritter's ex-fiancé. Rebecca felt something cold slide through her chest. "They will soon enough." "They will," Catherine agreed. "Which is why I need to tell you something. Tomorrow morning, we have a scheduled board meeting. It was on the calendar before your father's death. The purpose? To hear a formal acquisition proposal from Ritter Global. John Ritter himself is scheduled to present." Rebecca turned from the window, and when she met Catherine's eyes, something passed between them, understanding, strategy, and the beginning of something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. "He doesn't know I'll be there," Rebecca said. "No," Catherine confirmed. "The invitation was sent 6 weeks ago to the board of directors. As of yesterday, you are the board chair. You'll be sitting at the head of the table." Noelle made a sound that was half laugh, half gasp. "Oh my God. He's going to walk in expecting to pitch to a bunch of executives, and instead he'll find his ex-fiancée, the woman he publicly humiliated less than 24 hours ago, controlling the company he's desperate to acquire. Catherine's smile was subtle but unmistakable. "Miss Cole, I understand if you'd prefer to reschedule, given the circumstances." "No," Rebecca said, and this time her voice carried absolute certainty. "Tomorrow morning." "What time?" 9 a.m. sharp. Rebecca looked down at the city sprawling beneath her, at the empire her father had built and left in her hands, at the future that had cracked open like a door she'd been standing in front of her entire life. "Then I'll be there," she said quietly. "At the head of the table. Exactly where I belong." The Cole Innovations boardroom occupied the entire 42nd floor, a space designed to intimidate and inspire in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Manhattan like a kingdom waiting to be claimed. The conference table was a single piece of reclaimed walnut that could seat 20, its surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected the faces of everyone who sat there, including their lives. Rebecca arrived 30 minutes early, wearing a navy Tom Ford suit that her father's former assistant had delivered to her apartment that morning with a note. "Your father bought this for you 2 years ago. He said you'd need it when you were ready to lead." It fit perfectly. Catherine Wells was already there, reviewing documents with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complicated operation. "The Ritter delegation will arrive at 8:55, Catherine said without looking up. "John Ritter, Tasha Vale as strategic consultant, and James Morrison, their CFO. They've prepared a multimedia presentation. Very polished. Very expensive. Very desperate." "Does he know?" Rebecca asked, taking her seat at the head of the table, her father's seat, now hers. "About your position?" Catherine's smile was knife-sharp. "Not yet. His assistant confirmed the meeting with our previous interim chair yesterday morning. The updated board roster wasn't sent until 6 a.m. today. He won't have seen it." The other board members began filing in: David Chun, the Chief Technology Officer, Maria Santos, Chief Financial Officer, Robert Kim, Head of Development, 3 additional directors whose faces carried the weight of years building something they believed in. Each one stopped when they saw Rebecca, their expression shifting from curiosity to respect to something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. "Miss Cole," David Chun said, taking his seat to her right. "Your father would have loved this moment. He always said the universe had a sense of timing." At 8:55 exactly, the conference room doors opened. John Ritter walked in first, commanding the space the way he'd been taught since birth, chin up, shoulders back, smile calibrated to suggest both confidence and humility. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and he carried himself like a man who'd never been told no in any language that mattered. Behind him came James Morrison, looking nervous despite his expensive briefcase. And then Tasha Vale, elegant in cream silk, her expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses she didn't remove even indoors. John's presentation team followed, 2 young associates carrying tablets and a portable screen, their faces bright with the eagerness of people who believed they were about to witness their boss secure a career-defining deal. John's eyes swept the room, cataloging faces, calculating advantage, landing on each board member with practiced charm. His smile was the one Rebecca had once found irresistible, the one that suggested he was letting you in on a secret, making you complicit in his success. Then his gaze reached the head of the table. And stopped. The smile didn't just falter, it shattered. His face went through expressions so quickly they blurred together: confusion, recognition, disbelief, horror, and something that might have been rage or might have been fear or might have been the dawning realization that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Rebecca. Her name came out strangled, barely recognizable as language. She met his eyes with the same calm she'd shown at the engagement party, the calm of someone who had already survived the worst thing and found themselves still standing, still breathing, still fundamentally unbreakable. "Mr. Ritter. Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Her voice was professional, courteous, and absolutely devoid of anything personal. She could have been greeting a stranger. She could have been welcoming a vendor. She could have been addressing someone who had never held her hand, never kissed her forehead, never promised her forever while planning her demolition. Behind John, Tasha's face remained carefully neutral, but Rebecca saw her fingers tighten on her tablet. James Morrison looked like he wanted the floor to open and swallow him whole. I don't understand. John's voice cracked slightly. What are you doing here? I'm the board chair of Cole Innovations, Rebecca said simply. I believe you're here to present an acquisition proposal. We're ready to hear it. She gestured to the seats across from her, and the simple authority in that gesture, the ease with which she claimed the space, owned the moment, made something in John's face collapse further. He sat because standing would have been more conspicuous. Tasha and James flanked him, and his presentation team scrambled to set up their equipment with hands that trembled slightly. Catherine leaned forward, her voice professional and pitiless. Mr. Ritter, before you begin, I should clarify the board's composition for transparency. As of 48 hours ago, Rebecca Cole assumed majority ownership and board chair position following the death of her father, Marcus Cole, founder and CEO of this company. You're presenting to his daughter and his executive team. The color drained from John's face so completely he looked like a photograph of himself, all surface, no substance, already fading. Tasha removed her sunglasses slowly, and Rebecca saw calculation happening behind her eyes, the kind of recalibration that happened when someone realized they'd bet on the wrong side of history. Shall we begin? Rebecca said. John's presentation was everything Catherine had promised, polished, persuasive, backed by impressive projections and market analysis. He spoke about synergies and growth opportunities and strategic partnerships. His voice steadied as he moved through familiar material, the script he'd practiced giving him something to hide behind. But his hands shook when he changed slides. His eyes kept drifting to Rebecca's face, searching for something, anger, heartbreak, weakness, and finding only focused professional attention. When he finished, the room fell silent. Rebecca let the silence stretch, let it become uncomfortable, let it press against everyone until even the associates shifted in their seats. Then she spoke, her voice clear and final. Mr. Ritter, on behalf of Cole Innovations Board of Directors, I'm declining your proposal. John's face went slack with shock. The valuation is insufficient, the terms are unfavorable, and frankly, your company's track record with sustainable technology integration doesn't align with our standards. We've reviewed your previous developments, the solar panels and the Phoenix project that failed within 18 months, the water reclamation system in Denver that never functioned properly, the green certifications in Miami that were revoked for non-compliance. She slid a folder across the table, research his own desperation had blinded him to. Cole Innovations built its reputation on innovation that actually works, Mr. Ritter. We're not interested in licensing our patents to a company that would use them as marketing material rather than genuine commitment to sustainable housing. David Chun added quietly, we're also aware that your board gave you 6 months to secure these patents. That deadline is now 4.5 months away. Desperation isn't a compelling negotiating position. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. John's jaw clenched, and Rebecca saw the mask slip, saw the rage beneath the charm, the entitlement beneath the polish. This is personal, he said, his voice tight. You're making a business decision based on personal feelings. No, Rebecca said, and her voice carried steel wrapped in silk. I'm making a business decision based on merit, market analysis, and corporate responsibility. The fact that you assume any woman who rejects you must be acting emotionally rather than strategically tells me everything I need to know about why your company is failing. Tasha stood abruptly, gathering her things with practiced efficiency. I think we're done here, she said, her voice crisp. Thank you for your time, Miss Cole. She walked out without looking at John, and Rebecca saw the exact moment he realized he was losing Tasha the same way he'd lost Rebecca, not through drama or tears, but through cold calculation and self-preservation. The meeting dissolved. John's associates scrambled to pack their equipment. James Morrison mumbled apologies that no one acknowledged. And John stood frozen at the table, staring at Rebecca like he was seeing her for the first time and realizing he'd never actually known her at all. By noon, the story had leaked. Rebecca watched it spread across social media and financial news sites from her office window, the narrative writing itself with devastating efficiency. Ritter Global's desperate acquisition bid rejected. John Ritter's ex-fiancée now controls patents his company desperately needs. Questions about the timeline of their relationship and his business strategy. Her phone buzzed with messages from reporters, from former colleagues, from people she'd lost touch with years ago suddenly wanting to reconnect. She ignored them all except one, a text from Noelle. CNN just called you Manhattan's most powerful woman under 30. Also, Twitter is losing its collective mind. Also, I'm bringing champagne to your office immediately. Rebecca was reviewing contract proposals when Catherine knocked softly on her door. The Ritter Global stock dropped 4% in the last hour, Catherine said. Their board has called an emergency meeting. And Miss Cole. John Ritter is still in the building. Security says he's been sitting in the lobby for 20 minutes. Rebecca felt something twist in her chest, not sympathy, but the echo of someone she used to be, someone who would have rushed down to comfort him, to soften the blow, to make herself smaller so he could feel larger. That woman was gone. Let him sit, Rebecca said quietly. He'll leave eventually. But an hour later, as Rebecca walked toward the elevator, she found him waiting in the hallway outside her office. His suit was wrinkled now, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it, his eyes carrying the hollow look of someone watching their world collapse in real time. Rebecca, please. Can we just talk? 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. She stopped, and for a moment he seemed to think he'd reached her, that the woman who'd loved him was still accessible beneath the board chair and the power suit and the billion-dollar inheritance. He reached for her arm. She didn't pull away. That would have required acknowledging the touch meant something. Instead, she looked at his hand on her sleeve with a kind of distant curiosity someone might show a spider crawling across their desk. He dropped his hand. Rebecca met his eyes with perfect calm, perfect clarity, and perfect finality. You showed me who you were, she said, her voice soft enough that he had to lean in to hear. Today, I'm returning the favor. Then she stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was John Ritter standing alone in the hallway, diminished, desperate, and finally, devastatingly powerless. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Rebecca had walked out of her engagement party and into an empire. The Cole Innovations media room was packed beyond capacity. Journalists from the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Bloomberg, local news stations, international outlets, and a wall of cameras that would broadcast this moment to millions. They'd come expecting corporate announcements and financial projections. They'd come for the spectacle of watching Marcus Cole's mysterious heir make her public debut. What they got instead was a revolution wrapped in a navy Armani suit. Rebecca stood at the podium with the Cole Innovations logo behind her, flanked by Catherine Wells and David Chun. Her hands were steady on the wood. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the room lean forward. Good morning. My name is Rebecca Cole, and I'm the board chair and majority owner of Cole Innovations. Last week, I inherited this company from my father, Marcus Cole, a man I never had the privilege of knowing but whose legacy I'm honored to continue. She paused, letting the cameras capture her composure. My father built this company on a principle that shouldn't be revolutionary but somehow still is, that everyone, regardless of income, background, or circumstance, deserves to live in housing that is safe, sustainable, and dignified. Today, I'm announcing 3 initiatives that will expand that vision. The room erupted with the clicking of cameras and the scratch of pens on paper. First, Cole Innovations is committing $500 million over the next 5 years to develop affordable housing communities in 20 cities across North America. These won't be afterthoughts or charity projects. They'll be cutting-edge sustainable developments with the same technology, design standards, and environmental features as our luxury properties. Reporters scribbled furiously. Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength. Second, we're establishing the Marcus Cole Foundation, which will provide architectural scholarships specifically for women and minorities entering sustainable design fields. Because the future of housing shouldn't be designed exclusively by people who look like the past. A few people in the audience actually applauded. Rebecca waited for silence before delivering what she knew would become the headline. And third, and most important to me personally, Cole Innovations is partnering with national women's organizations to develop and fund secure transitional housing facilities in 15 cities. These facilities will provide safe, dignified housing for women and families escaping domestic violence, manipulation, or coercive relationships. Her voice softened but lost none of its power. These won't be shelters in the traditional sense. They'll be self-contained apartment communities with on-site counseling, legal services, job training, childcare, and security. Because leaving an abusive or manipulative situation shouldn't mean choosing between safety and homelessness. No woman should ever have to stay somewhere that diminishes her because she lacks resources or options. The room fell absolutely silent. I'm calling this initiative the Freedom Project, because freedom isn't just the absence of danger, it's the presence of real choices. It's having enough resources to walk away from anything or anyone that treats you as less than you are. It's having the power to say no and mean it, without fear of consequence. She looked directly into the cameras, and when she spoke again, her words were clearly meant for women who would hear them in living rooms and offices and hospital waiting rooms across the country. To every woman who's ever been made to feel small, disposable, or replaceable, to everyone who's been told they should be grateful for scraps of respect, I want you to know this: you are not the problem. You never were. And there are people building pathways out for you. There is always a door you haven't tried yet. The questions came rapid fire after that, but Rebecca handled each one with the precision she'd once used to design load-bearing walls and structural integrity. She was asked about her relationship with John Ritter. She declined to comment on personal matters. She was asked about yesterday's rejected acquisition proposal. She stated simply that it hadn't met the company's standards. She was asked how it felt to suddenly become one of the wealthiest women in America. She said the wealth was only meaningful if it created pathways for others. By noon, the press conference had gone viral. By 3 p.m., #Freedom Project was trending on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. By 6 p.m., Rebecca's face was on the cover of every major news website with headlines that ranged from heartbreak to hope. Rebecca Cole's remarkable rise to the billionaire who believes in second chances, to simply the woman who walked away and built an empire. The video clips spread like wildfire. Her calm delivery, her personal story, her refusal to be bitter or vindictive even as she launched initiatives that would reshape urban housing policy. Women's organizations praised her. Architectural journals analyzed her vision. Financial analysts predicted Cole Innovations stock would surge based purely on public goodwill. And in a penthouse apartment 40 blocks away, John Ritter sat alone in the dark, watching Rebecca's press conference replay on every channel. He'd sent Tasha home hours ago after a fight that had devolved into her screaming that he was professionally radioactive, and she couldn't afford to be associated with his catastrophic judgment anymore. His mother had called 6 times. His father had summoned him to the family estate for an urgent conversation tomorrow morning, which in Ritter family language meant an execution disguised as breakfast. John watched Rebecca speak about creating pathways for women escaping manipulation, and something cold slithered through his chest. She never said his name. She never referenced their relationship directly. But everyone knew. Everyone understood exactly what she meant when she talked about women being made to feel disposable. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He opened it to find a link to a Vanity Fair article published 20 minutes ago. Tasha Vale, John Ritter lost the only woman in Manhattan who had any actual dignity. He clicked through with hands that trembled. The interview was devastating. Tasha, photographed in black against a white background looking like justice personified, spoke with surgical precision about men who mistake compliance for love, and the particular tragedy of brilliant women who temporarily lose themselves in mediocre men's egos. Rebecca Cole walked away from a situation that would have destroyed most people, Tasha was quoted saying. She did it with more grace than John Ritter showed in his entire relationship with her. I worked with him for 6 months on the acquisition strategy, and I can say with certainty, he saw her as an access point to her father's patents, not a partner to be cherished. He deserves everything he's losing. She deserves everything she's gaining. John threw his phone across the room, where it shattered against the wall with a sound like something breaking that couldn't be repaired. Meanwhile, Rebecca was having dinner with Noelle at a small Italian restaurant in the village, far from the cameras and the headlines and the empire she now commanded. "You're a literal icon," Noelle said. showing Rebecca her phone where TikTok videos of young women had already started circulating, thousands of them, sharing their own stories of walking away, of choosing themselves, of refusing to shrink. There are girls making videos saying you gave them the courage to leave bad relationships. There are women saying they're going back to school because you reminded them they're worth investing in. Rebecca stared at the screen, at the faces of strangers who'd somehow connected to words she'd spoken from her own fractured heart. "I just told the truth," she said quietly. "I just said what I needed to hear a week ago." "That's why it matters," Noelle said. "Because it wasn't a corporate speech. It was real. And real is the rarest thing in Manhattan." Back at her apartment that night, Rebecca found a stack of messages waiting. Corporations wanting partnerships, organizations requesting appearances, magazines wanting interviews. She ignored most of them, then paused on one email that had arrived an hour ago. Subject: Speaking Invitation, Global Innovation Summit from Dr. Sarah Chun, Summit Director. Dear Miss Cole, on behalf of the Global Innovation Summit Organizing Committee, I'm writing to invite you to deliver the keynote address at this year's conference in Singapore. The summit brings together the world's leading innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders to discuss sustainable development and social impact. We were particularly moved by your press conference today and believe your vision for equitable housing development represents exactly the kind of innovation the world needs. The keynote address would reach an audience of over 3,000 international leaders and be broadcast to millions globally. I should mention that John Ritter of Ritter Global is also scheduled to present a breakout session on sustainable urban development. We understand there may be complexity in that arrangement. If you'd prefer, we can. Rebecca stopped reading and looked out her window at the Manhattan skyline, the city where a week ago she'd been someone's discarded fiancé, and tonight she was someone who'd built a platform powerful enough to reach women she'd never meet in places she'd never been. She opened her laptop and began typing her response. Dear Dr. Chun, thank you for the invitation. I accept. Regarding Mr. Ritter's attendance, that won't be a problem. I have no interest in avoiding men who underestimated me. I'm far more interested in addressing the people who didn't. I look forward to Singapore. Best regards, Rebecca Cole. She hit send, then opened the document Richard Sterling had left her, the comprehensive file on Cole Innovation's upcoming projects, partnerships, and strategic initiatives. Tomorrow, she had meetings with the architectural team designing the first Freedom Project facility. Next week, she was reviewing applications for the Marcus Cole Foundation scholarships. Next month, she'd be touring development sites in Detroit and New Orleans. And in 6 weeks, she'd stand on a stage in Singapore in front of the world's most influential leaders and tell them exactly what she'd learned in the past 7 days. That walking away was sometimes the most powerful thing you could do. That inheritance wasn't just about money, it was about legacy, responsibility, and choice. And that the woman who'd been told she was disposable had become, in the span of 1 week, absolutely irreplaceable. The emergency board meeting began at 7 a.m. on a Monday morning, which in corporate language meant, this is an execution, not a discussion. John sat at the conference table in Ritter Global's executive suite, surrounded by 12 faces that had once looked at him with confidence, with faith in his vision, with a kind of automatic respect that came from being born into the right family with the right last name. Now they looked at him like he was a liability that needed to be managed before it metastasized. His father, Richard Ritter Sr., sat at the opposite end of the table, his expression carved from granite and disappointment. In the past 8 days, the CFO began, her voice professionally neutral in a way that felt more damning than anger, Ritter Global stock has dropped 11%. We've lost 3 major investors. 2 development partnerships have been put on indefinite hold pending leadership evaluation. And our primary competitor just announced they're in talks with Cole Innovations for technology licensing, the exact patents we've been trying to acquire for 3 years. She slid a folder across the table toward John. Social media sentiment analysis shows that 73% of conversations about Ritter Global in the past week reference your personal conduct. The PR team is being asked daily about the relationship between our acquisition strategy and your engagement to Marcus Cole's daughter. Business journals are writing think pieces about nepotism and corporate ethics. John's hands clenched under the table. I made a business decision based on merit. You humiliated your fiancé at your engagement party, his father interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that came from watching a legacy being destroyed by incompetence. You created a public spectacle that made this company look predatory and unprofessional. And now the woman you discarded is a national icon, while you're a cautionary tale about entitlement. The words landed like physical blows. Margaret Torres, the head of corporate communications, leaned forward. John, the board has voted. You're being placed on immediate administrative leave. You'll retain your title temporarily, but you'll have no operational authority. You'll make no public statements. You'll attend no industry events. You'll also begin working with Dr. Patricia Morrison, a corporate psychologist who specializes in executive rehabilitation, Margaret continued as if he hadn't spoken. The board views this as essential for any possibility of your return to active leadership. John felt the room tilt slightly. You're forcing me into therapy? We're requiring you to address whatever led to judgment so catastrophically poor that it cost this company hundreds of millions in market value and irreparable reputational damage, his father said flatly. Consider yourself fortunate we're not demanding your resignation entirely. The meeting ended with instructions delivered like a prison sentence. Dr. Morrison's office, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. No exceptions. No rescheduling. No excuses. John left the building through the parking garage to avoid the journalists who'd been camped outside Ritter Global's headquarters for days. His driver took him home in silence, and John spent the rest of the day in his penthouse, watching the city move below him with all the distance of someone observing life through bulletproof glass. His phone buzzed constantly, messages from friends asking if he was okay. They weren't really friends, business associates distancing themselves. They'd never been associates, just people who wanted proximity to power. And one text from Tasha that simply read, "We need to talk. Today." She arrived at 6 p.m., let herself in with the key she still had, and stood in his living room looking like a stranger wearing a familiar face. "I'm leaving," she said without preamble. "Not just the consulting contract, all of it. I'm done, John." He'd been expecting this. Somehow it still felt like the floor dropping out. "Tasha, listen." "No. You listen. For once in your entitled life, just listen." Her voice was sharp enough to cut. "I worked with you for 6 months on the coal acquisition. I watched you strategize around Rebecca like she was a chess piece instead of a person. I watched you accelerate the engagement timeline to coincide with patent negotiations. I watched you bring me back into your life specifically to manufacture a situation where she'd feel insecure enough to be compliant." John opened his mouth to protest, but the words died before reaching air. "You didn't love her," Tasha continued. "You loved what she represented, access to her father's company, a sympathetic image for your board, a woman accomplished enough to be impressive but insecure enough to be managed. And when she didn't break the way you expected, when she walked away instead of begging to stay, you realized too late that you'd actually lost something irreplaceable. That's not. You're a coward hiding behind money," Tasha said, and her voice carried something that sounded almost like pity. "You've never had to develop actual courage because you've never faced actual consequences. Until now. Until Rebecca Cole decided she'd rather have nothing than have you." She set her key on the marble counter with a soft click that sounded final. "I hope you figure yourself out, John. Not for Rebecca's sake. She's already 3 miles ahead of you and accelerating. For your own sake. Because right now, you're not even a shadow of the man you could have been." The door closed behind her with quiet finality, and John stood alone in his penthouse that suddenly felt less like a home and more like an expensive cage. Dr. Patricia Morrison's office was in Midtown, deliberately understated, with none of the leather and mahogany that corporate executives usually preferred. The walls were cream, the furniture comfortable but not luxurious, and the woman herself was in her 50s with silver hair and eyes that suggested she'd heard every excuse and saw through all of them. "Your board has mandated these sessions," she began without pleasantries. "But I want to be clear, I can't help you rebuild your image or manage your public perception. I can only help you understand why you made the choices you made. The rest is up to you." For the first 3 sessions, John performed. He said what he thought she wanted to hear. He blamed stress, business pressure, the weight of expectations. He intellectualized and rationalized and maintained perfect emotional distance. Dr. Morrison listened without comment, her expression neutral, until the fourth session when she finally interrupted him mid-explanation. "John, do you actually want to understand what happened? Or are you just here because your board required it?" The question landed wrong, too direct, too honest, stripping away the protective layers he'd been maintaining. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty surprised him. "Then let me ask you something different." Dr. Morrison leaned forward slightly. "When you told Rebecca that Tasha was moving in, what were you actually expecting would happen?" John opened his mouth, then closed it. He'd never really examined that moment, just acted on instinct and entitlement and the assumption that Rebecca would accommodate him because that's what people in his life always did. "I thought." His voice caught. "I thought she'd be upset but ultimately accept it. I thought she'd value the relationship enough to compromise." "Compromise," Dr. Morrison repeated. "Is that what you'd call it? Requiring your fiancé to accept your ex-girlfriend moving into your home?" "I was being honest about what I needed." "You were testing how much she'd diminish herself to keep you," Dr. Morrison said, her voice gentle but unflinching. "You created an impossible situation specifically to see if she'd make herself smaller to fit into your life. And when she refused, when she chose herself instead of you, you were shocked." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning. "That's not." John tried, but the defense collapsed before it fully formed. "Let me ask you something, John." Dr. Morrison's voice softened. "If you had actually loved her, genuinely loved her as a complete person rather than as someone who served a purpose in your life, why did you try to cage her?" The question landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. And for the first time since that engagement party, John Ritter felt his carefully constructed facade crack wide open. The sound that came out wasn't words. It was something raw, something that had been building for 8 days and maybe for his entire life. It was the sound of someone finally, devastatingly, encountering the truth of what they'd done and who they'd been. "I didn't love her," he whispered, and the admission tasted like ash. "I didn't love her enough. I loved what she could give me. I loved how she made me look. I loved the patents her father had and the image she projected and the way she made me feel like I was evolved and modern for treating her like an equal when I never actually did." The tears came then, ugly, graceless, nothing like the controlled emotion he'd been trained to display in board meetings and press conferences. "I told myself I was being honest, being evolved, giving her the real me," he continued, his voice breaking. "But I was just testing whether she'd shrink herself enough to keep me. And she didn't. She walked away like I was nothing, and I can't stop seeing her face, that calm, that certainty, that complete lack of need for me." He looked up at Dr. Morrison, his face wet with tears he couldn't control. "She became everything I told myself I was, and I'm sitting here realizing I'm nothing like what I thought I was. I'm just a man who had something extraordinary and destroyed it because I couldn't see past my own reflection long enough to value it." Dr. Morrison handed him a tissue, her expression carrying something that might have been compassion. "That's the first honest thing you've said since you walked into this office," she said quietly. "And it's the only place we can begin." John buried his face in his hands, and for the first time in his 34 years he cried, not for his company or his reputation or his status, but for the woman he'd lost and the man he'd never actually been. Singapore's Marina Bay Sands Convention Center glittered like a jewel against the twilight sky, 3 towers connected by a sky park that seemed to float above the city. The Global Innovation Summit had transformed the venue into a cathedral of possibility. Everywhere Rebecca looked, she saw the world's most influential minds gathered to discuss the future they were collectively building. She arrived wearing an emerald silk gown that moved like water, her hair swept back in a way that suggested both elegance and authority. Catherine had accompanied her, along with 2 members of Cole Innovation security team, who maintained professional distance while ensuring her safety. "You ready for this?" Catherine asked as they approached the VIP entrance where cameras flashed like lightning. "I've faced worse," Rebecca said, and meant it. The press response was immediate and enthusiastic. Rebecca moved through the gauntlet with practiced grace, answering questions about the Freedom Project's first facility groundbreaking, Coal Innovation's upcoming developments, and her vision for sustainable housing that didn't sacrifice dignity for affordability. Inside, the summit buzzed with energy. 3,000 attendees from 60 countries filled the space. CEOs, innovators, philanthropists, policymakers, and academics all gathered under the banner of building a better world. Rebecca moved through them like someone who belonged, because she did. She was stopped every few feet by people who wanted to introduce themselves, to praise her press conference, to discuss partnerships and possibilities. A Nobel Prize-winning economist asked about her affordable housing model. The CEO of a major environmental foundation wanted to discuss collaboration. A young woman from a Kenyan sustainable development startup approached with tears in her eyes to thank Rebecca for speaking about choosing yourself. "You made me realize I was making myself small in my own company," the woman said. "I went back and renegotiated my equity position. Your words gave me courage." Rebecca held her hand and felt the weight and gift of what she'd accidentally become. Not just a businesswoman, but a symbol of something larger than herself. And somewhere in that massive crowd, John Ritter watched it all unfold. He'd arrived the day before, had checked into his hotel room, and had spent most of the evening in therapy via video call with Dr. Morrison, preparing himself for this moment. He'd seen Rebecca's name on the keynote schedule. He'd known she'd be here. He'd told himself he was ready. He wasn't ready. Nothing could have prepared him for the sight of Rebecca standing at the center of a circle of the world's most powerful people, commanding space with effortless authority, laughing with genuine warmth at something the Swedish Minister of Housing was saying. She glowed, not with makeup or jewelry, though both were impeccable, but with the inner radiance of someone who'd finally fully stepped into their own power. This wasn't the woman who'd stood beside him at their engagement party, adjusting herself to fit his expectations. This was someone entirely new, or perhaps someone who'd always been there, just waiting for the cage door to open. The keynote address began at 8 p.m. Rebecca took the stage to thunderous applause, standing before 3,000 people and countless more watching the live stream, and delivered a speech that would be quoted in business schools and women's organizations for years to come. 7 weeks ago, she began, her voice clear and unwavering, I thought I knew who I was. I was someone's fiancé. Someone's potential asset. Someone trying very hard to be grateful for a life that required me to shrink. The audience leaned forward collectively. Then, in a single evening, that identity was stripped away. And I discovered something remarkable. Beneath who I'd been trying to be was someone I'd forgotten existed. Someone who didn't need permission to be powerful. Someone who'd been waiting patiently for the moment she could finally stand up. She spoke about her father's legacy, about inheriting not just wealth but responsibility. She spoke about the Freedom Project and the thousands of women who'd reached out to share their stories of walking away from situations that diminished them. She spoke about sustainable development not as a luxury but as a fundamental right, that everyone deserved to live in spaces that reflected their worth. We spend so much time building structures, she said, gesturing to the images behind her of Coal Innovation's developments. But the most important structure we build is our sense of self-worth. And sometimes the most radical thing we can do is refuse to live in any space, physical, emotional, or professional, that requires us to be less than we are. The applause when she finished was deafening. John sat in the back section reserved for presenters, watching her take her bows, watching the standing ovation, watching person after person approach her as she left the stage. He saw clearly, for perhaps the first time, that he hadn't lost Rebecca. He'd never actually had her. He'd only had the version of herself she'd been willing to temporarily pretend to be. Backstage, Rebecca was surrounded by summit organizers, journalists requesting interviews, and attendees who'd rushed from the main hall to meet her. Catherine ran interference with practiced efficiency, scheduling follow-ups and politely declining requests that weren't priorities. Then, through a gap in the crowd, Rebecca saw him. John stood about 20 feet away, wearing a suit that looked expensive and pressed but somehow diminished on him, as if the past 7 weeks had taken something fundamental and replaced it with uncertainty. His face had changed, not physically, but in some indefinable way that suggested he'd been forced to look at himself without flattering lighting. Their eyes met, and Rebecca felt nothing. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Not the ghost of love or the echo of heartbreak. Just calm recognition, like seeing someone you used to know in a photograph from another lifetime. He approached slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a wild animal they didn't want to startle. The crowd around Rebecca noticed and went quiet, sensing the significance of this moment even if they didn't know the full story. Catherine moved to intercede, but Rebecca raised a hand slightly. "It's fine," she said quietly. John stopped a respectful distance away, his hands visible at his sides in an unconscious gesture of non-threat. "Rebecca." His voice was rougher than she remembered. "Could we talk? Privately? Just for a moment." She studied him for a beat, then nodded to Catherine, who led them to a small conference room off the main corridor. Catherine stepped outside but remained visible through the glass door, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to allow privacy. They stood facing each other in the quiet room, and John seemed to struggle with where to begin. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he finally said. "I'm not here to make excuses or explain myself. I'm just here to say that I'm sorry. For all of it. For using you. For treating you like a means to an end. For creating that scene at the engagement party. For every moment I made you feel like you needed to be smaller to fit into my life." Rebecca listened without expression, her hands folded calmly in front of her. "I've spent the past 7 weeks in therapy," John continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Really examining who I am and what I did. And I've realized that I never actually loved you the way you deserved. I loved the idea of you. I loved what you represented. But I never saw you, the real you, because I was too busy trying to fit you into a role in my story." He paused, clearly fighting for composure. "Watching you tonight, seeing who you've become, who you always were, I finally understand what I lost. Not the patents or the business opportunity or the advantageous marriage. But a woman who was extraordinary, and I was too shallow and entitled to recognize it." Rebecca's expression didn't change, didn't soften, but she listened with the kind of attention that suggested she was actually hearing him. "I don't expect forgiveness," John said quietly. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. I see who you are. And I'm genuinely sorry." The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable, but Rebecca didn't rush to fill it. She let his words settle, let herself feel whether they changed anything fundamental. They didn't. Finally she spoke, her voice gentle but absolutely firm. "John, I believe you're sorry. I believe you've done the work to understand what happened. And I genuinely hope you grow into someone better than who you were." Something like hope flickered in his eyes. Then she continued, and her next words extinguished it. "But growth does not guarantee return." The words landed with quiet finality. "I forgive you," Rebecca said, and meant it. "Not because you've earned it, but because holding on to anger would give you more space in my life than you deserve. I forgive you so I can fully let you go." John's face crumpled slightly. "But forgiveness isn't reconciliation," she continued. "It isn't an invitation back into my life. It's simply the closing of a door that should have been closed the moment you tried to make me choose between my dignity and your comfort." She took a small step back, a physical manifestation of emotional distance. "You're learning to be better. That's admirable. But you're learning on someone else's time now, with someone else's heart. I'm not a rehabilitation project. I'm not a second chance. I'm not the woman who makes you a better man by staying close enough for you to hurt while you figure yourself out." Her voice remained calm, almost kind, which somehow made the words more devastating. "I hope you find what you're looking for, John. I hope you become the person you're trying to be. But you're going to do that without me, and you're going to do that knowing that some bridges, once burned, are never rebuilt, not because of cruelty, but because the person on the other side has already crossed into territory you can never reach." She moved toward the door, and John found his voice one last time. "Rebecca, wait." She paused, her hand on the door handle, and looked back at him with eyes that held no malice but also no warmth. "Thank you for the apology," she said softly. "It took courage to come here and say those things. But courage doesn't erase consequence. And consequence, John, is that I've already moved on. Not to someone else. To myself. To a version of me that exists completely independent of you." She opened the door, and the sound of the summit flooded back in, voices discussing the future, possibilities being born, the world moving forward without pause. Goodbye, John. She walked back into that world, her world now, leaving him standing alone in a conference room that suddenly felt very small, very quiet, and very final. Through the glass, John watched her rejoin Catherine, watched them walk back toward the main hall where people were already gathering to congratulate her. He watched her laugh at something Catherine said, watched her shake hands with a Japanese minister of urban development, watched her move through space with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and required no external validation. He watched until she disappeared into the crowd, and he understood with absolute clarity that he was watching someone walk away for the last time. Not in anger. Not in pain. In completion. 6 months after Singapore, Rebecca stood in the construction site of the Freedom Project's first completed facility in Brooklyn, wearing a hard hat and work boots beneath her tailored coat, watching the final solar panels being installed on the roof. The building was beautiful, 4 stories of sustainable architecture that didn't look like charity or compromise. Floor-to-ceiling windows-flooded apartments with natural light. Community spaces on the ground floor included a childcare center, counseling offices, and a job training facility. Rooftop gardens would provide fresh produce and green space. Every detail had been designed with the same care, the same standards, the same commitment to excellence that Cole Innovations brought to their luxury developments. Final inspection passed this morning, Catherine said, approaching with a tablet full of documents. We're cleared to begin resident move-ins next week. Applications exceeded capacity by 400%. The selection committee had to make impossible choices. Rebecca looked at the building, the first of 15 planned across the country, and felt something shift in her chest. This was real. This was tangible. This was proof that wealth wasn't just numbers and accounts, but the ability to reshape lives. Then we build more, Rebecca said simply. If there are 400% more women who need this, we find a way to build 400% more facilities. Over the following months, Cole Innovations expanded beyond what even Marcus Cole had envisioned. Rebecca restructured the company's priorities, balancing luxury developments that funded their mission-driven work with affordable housing initiatives that served communities that had been systematically underserved. She became a fixture on the keynote circuit, speaking at women's economic empowerment summits, sustainable development conferences, architectural forums. Her TED Talk, Building Spaces That Refuse to Shrink You, was viewed 12 million times in its first month. Business schools began teaching case studies on her leadership model. Young women started architecture and business programs, citing her as inspiration. But the changes that mattered most were quieter. She hired brilliant young women and minorities into leadership positions, not as tokens but as talents who'd been overlooked by companies that couldn't see past traditional power structures. She restructured Cole Innovations' parental leave policies, implemented pay transparency, and created mentorship programs that ensured the next generation wouldn't face the barriers she had. And slowly, carefully, she began building a life that existed beyond the empire. She met Dr. James Okonkwo at a sustainable development conference in Nairobi, where he was presenting research on climate-adaptive housing for displaced populations. He was a professor at MIT, brilliant and unassuming, with warm eyes and a laugh that sounded like home. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours, sprawling from conference center chairs to a cafe to a walk through the city as twilight fell. He talked about architecture as social justice. She talked about housing as human dignity. Neither of them noticed when the conference ended and everyone else went home. "You're Rebecca Cole," he said at one point, not like he was starstruck but like he was placing context. The woman who walked away. "I'm the woman who walked toward something better," she corrected gently. "There's a difference." He smiled. "I like that version better." They exchanged numbers. He emailed her research papers. She sent him architectural plans for the Freedom Project. Their conversations were intellectual, respectful, devoid of any agenda beyond genuine connection. When he visited New York 3 months later for a lecture series, she met him for dinner at a small Ethiopian restaurant in Harlem, far from the tabloid cameras and society expectations. "I should tell you," James said over shared plates of injera and what, "I'm not interested in Rebecca Cole the billionaire or Rebecca Cole the icon. I'm interested in Rebecca Cole, who gets genuinely excited about water reclamation systems and sends me research articles at 2 a.m. with notes in the margins. Rebecca felt something in her chest loosen, something that had been held tight for longer than she realized. That's the only version of me that actually exists, she said. The rest is just job description. Good, James said, and his smile was warm and genuine and devoid of any need to possess or diminish. Because that's the version worth knowing. They took it slow, dinners when his research brought him to New York, long phone calls about everything and nothing, visits to museum exhibitions and architecture sites. There was no performance, no strategy, no calculation. Just two people discovering whether they liked each other's company more than they liked solitude. Rebecca found herself laughing more, sleeping better, looking forward to mornings rather than just enduring them. But the deepest healing came from an unexpected source. Richard Sterling called on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, his voice carrying the particular weight that meant he was bearing important news. Miss Cole, I've been going through your father's personal effects, documents we preserved from his home office. There's something I should have given you months ago, but the instructions were specific. He wanted you to have it only after you'd taken time to settle into the company, to understand his work, to build your own relationship with what he'd created. What is it? Rebecca asked, something in her chest tightening. A letter. The last thing he wrote before he died. He left it with his attorney with very clear instructions. Rebecca receives this when she's ready. Not when she inherits. When she's ready. The envelope arrived by courier that evening. Thick cream paper, her name written in her father's handwriting, sealed with old-fashioned wax. Rebecca sat in her apartment overlooking the city, Noel beside her on the couch for moral support, and opened the letter with trembling hands. My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, then you know. You know who I was, what I built, and what I left behind twice. Once when I left your mother, and once when death took me before I found the courage to reach out. I have no defense for my absence. No justification that would make 27 years of silence acceptable. I was a coward who built empires but couldn't face the daughter whose eyes held my mistakes reflected back at me. But please know this, you were never forgotten. Not for a single day. I watched you grow from afar, your graduation, your achievements, your firm, your engagement. I saw you become everything I dreamed you could be and more than I had any right to be proud of. You inherited my mind for design and your mother's grace under pressure, and you built something remarkable completely independent of my name or my wealth. When I learned about John Ritter, when my team began investigating his intentions, I felt the old familiar helplessness. I couldn't protect you. I'd forfeited that right. But I could ensure that if you ever needed to walk away from anything or anyone, you'd have the resources to do so without fear. Rebecca, the money, the company, the patents, they're not an apology. Nothing can apologize for absence. They're simply tools. Use them however you choose. Build what calls to you. Help who needs helping. Live a life that requires no one's permission. But more than the wealth, I'm leaving you journals. 43 years of a father who loved you from a distance he was too ashamed to cross. Read them when you're ready. Burn them if that brings peace. They're simply proof that you were loved, even by someone who loved you badly. I'm sorry I never found the courage to knock on your door. I'm sorry you'll read this knowing I'm gone. I'm sorry for all the moments I missed because I was too proud to admit I'd made a mistake that could be forgiven. But I'm not sorry for you. You needed nothing from me to become extraordinary. You did that entirely on your own. Live fully, my brilliant daughter. Love deeply. Build structures that refuse to shrink anyone. And know that somewhere, a flawed man spent his entire adult life watching you shine and wishing he'd been brave enough to tell you to your face. I love you. I always have. I'm sorry that love wasn't enough to make me braver. Your father, Marcus Cole. Rebecca's hand shook as she finished reading, tears streaming down her face. Not bitter tears, but the complicated grief of loving someone she'd never known, forgiving someone who'd never asked, and mourning what could have been while accepting what was. Noelle wrapped her arms around her, and Rebecca sobbed into her best friend's shoulder, for the father who'd watched from the back row, for the man who'd built her an empire as penance, for the 27 years of questions that would never get verbal answers but had received this, a letter that proved she'd been loved, even imperfectly. That evening, Rebecca sat at her desk and wrote her own letter, not to send anywhere, but to release into the universe. Dear Dad, I forgive you. Not because you earned it, but because carrying resentment toward a ghost serves no one. Thank you for the journals. Thank you for watching. Thank you for building something I could use to help people who feel as powerless as you must have felt. I wish you'd knocked on my door. I wish I'd known you. But I understand now that sometimes love looks like staying away because you're too broken to trust yourself not to cause more damage. I'm using everything you left me to build the kind of world where people don't have to choose between dignity and security. Where walking away is always possible. Where no one has to stay small to survive. I hope that makes you proud, wherever you are. Your daughter, Rebecca. She sealed it in an envelope, then tucked it into the first journal, the one dated the year she was born, and placed it on the shelf beside all the others. 2 weeks later, an invitation arrived on heavy cardstock with gold lettering. You are cordially invited to the annual Foundation Gala honoring Rebecca Cole and the Freedom Project. Your vision has transformed lives. Please join us in celebrating the launch of our 10th facility and the scholarship program that bears your name. Rebecca held the invitation, feeling the weight of what the past 8 months had built, not just buildings and programs, but a legacy that honored her father's regrets by ensuring fewer people would carry similar ones. She called James, who was in Cambridge finishing the semester. There's a gala in 2 weeks, she said. It's honoring the foundation work. Very formal. Probably tedious. Definitely filled with speeches and people wanting to network. Sounds terrible, James said, and she could hear his smile through the phone. Would you come with me anyway? There was a pause, then his voice warm and certain, I'd be honored. Rebecca looked out at the Manhattan skyline, the city where 8 months ago she'd walked away from one life and into another. Where she discovered that inheritance wasn't just about money but about choice, responsibility, and the courage to build something that mattered. She was ready for whatever came next. The ballroom shimmered like a universe made of crystal and gold. Hundreds of hand-blown chandeliers cast soft constellations of light across the marble floors, and the air hummed with the quiet thrill of Manhattan's most influential minds gathered for the annual Global Visionaries Gala, a night honoring leaders who'd reshaped industries, cities, and lives. But the room didn't truly come alive until Rebecca Cole walked in. She stepped through the grand archway wearing a gown of midnight silk that caught the light like liquid starlight, her hair swept into a sleek, regal twist. Cameras didn't flash. This event was too dignified for that, but heads turned one by one, like a wave moving through the sea of gowns and tuxedos. Conversations faltered. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. And then, almost as if choreographed, the entire room rose to its feet. It wasn't polite applause. It was reverence. Not for her wealth. Not for her company. Not for the empire she'd inherited. It was reverence for what she had built from the ashes. Her voice, her mission, her fearlessness. Her freedom. The Freedom Project had, in 8 months, opened its first 3 facilities, with 12 more breaking ground. Thousands of women had already walked through doors that had once been closed to them. Tonight, she was being honored for it. Noelle appeared at her side like a guardian angel in red satin, whispering, "You just shut down the entire room with a single step. I hope you realize that." Rebecca smiled, serene and steady. "I'm just here to celebrate the work." "Sure," Noelle muttered. "And I'm here for the salad." They laughed, soft and private, as guests continued applauding. The sound wrapped around Rebecca like warm silk. When she finally moved forward, the crowd parted for her, not because she demanded it, but because she had become the kind of woman people naturally made space for. Halfway into the ballroom, she felt rather than saw the shift in the air. A familiar presence. A memory dressed in tailored navy. John Ritter. He stood near a column wrapped in winter roses, speaking quietly with a tech investor. He wore a conservative suit, nothing flashy, almost subdued. When he noticed the applause swelling, he turned. His breath caught. For the first time in months, their eyes met. And the silence between them felt nothing like the one in the penthouse ballroom at their engagement party. That silence had been sharp. This one was soft. John looked, smaller. Not physically, his 6-foot frame remained, but something in him had folded inward, gentled by humility rather than brokenness. His eyes no longer held entitlement. They held understanding. And something like respect. He didn't try to approach her. Didn't force a moment. Didn't pretend he had the right to interrupt her rise. He simply nodded. A quiet, respectful acknowledgement. A thank you, an apology, and a farewell woven into one small gesture. Rebecca's response was simple and genuine. She smiled. Not triumphantly. Not pityingly. Just kindly. It was the kind of smile given to someone who had once been part of a story that would never again define her. Then she looked away. Completely, fully, gently away. And the earth didn't shake. Her heart didn't stutter. The past didn't cling. It simply released. Because tonight wasn't about John Ritter. It wasn't about what had been lost or what had been broken. It was about who she had become once she stopped shrinking. The orchestra swelled as she moved through the glittering crowd, accepting greetings, handshakes, and hugs from CEOs, activists, philanthropists, and ambassadors. Everyone wanted a moment with her. A woman who'd turned heartbreak into a blueprint for liberation. A woman who had refused to disappear. Finally, as the lights dimmed and the stage curtains parted, the gala host, a celebrated journalist, took the microphone. Tonight, she said, we honor a woman who has redefined not only sustainable housing, but the meaning of empowerment. A woman who turned personal devastation into global transformation. A woman whose work has already saved lives and will continue to change the course of generations. A spotlight swept across the room, coming to rest on Rebecca. Please welcome the founder of the Freedom Project and CEO of Cole Innovations, Rebecca Cole. The applause was thunderous, rolling, alive, unstoppable. Noelle squeezed her hand before she ascended the stage. Go get your crown. But the truth was, Rebecca didn't need a crown. She was the crown. She moved with graceful certainty up the steps, the room rising again in her honor. Standing behind the podium, she took a moment to look at the audience. So many faces, so many stories, so much possibility. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady as steel wrapped in velvet. Thank you. I stand here tonight humbled, not by the recognition, but by the courage I've witnessed in the women whose journeys have intersected with mine. The room leaned in. 8 months ago, I stood at an event where my world changed in a single moment. And for a while, I believed that moment was a breaking point. But the truth. She let the silence stretch, warm and full. It was an awakening. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I realized that sometimes, we are brought to the edge of ourselves not to fall, but to fly. That heartbreak isn't always an ending, it's a doorway. And once you walk through it, you see yourself clearly for the first time. Cameras glimmered. Women in the audience wiped silent tears. Rebecca continued, her voice deepening with power. Tonight, I want to speak particularly to the women in this room, and to the women watching at home, or from shelters, or from quiet battles no one else sees. She paused. Then delivered the words she'd carried inside her for months. We are not defined by who leaves us, or who tries to contain us. We are defined by who we become once we refuse to shrink. A stillness fell over the ballroom. Then the applause exploded, thunderous, standing, echoing through the glass domes and marble walls. It wasn't applause for wealth or success. It was applause for liberation. Applause for every woman who had ever walked away from something meant to break her. Applause for the empire she had built from the simple, powerful act of choosing herself. Rebecca stepped back from the podium, the lights catching her like dawn catching glass. And as the applause rose higher, brighter, louder, she didn't walk out of the past anymore. She walked into her empire.
And that, my beautiful family, is how a man who thought control was love learned that real power is compassion. John built a life of marble and ego, a fortress where only his pride could breathe. But it took one extraordinary woman, Rebecca, to show him that strength isn't measured by dominance, but by the courage to grow. She was wounded and chose purpose. He was privileged and finally chose humility. And together, they taught us this. Healing isn't loud, it's the quiet choosing of yourself again and again. So if you've ever felt unseen or underestimated, remember, your rise is coming. Until next time, this is Mr. Crown Stories reminding you, you are seen, you are worthy, and your light is the chapter someone else needs to begin.